and glamour. But there's a long history dating back tens of thousands of years to Los Angeles, and we're going to have a little explore through that and see how we got to the modern day. Just a quick reminder on the sort of the various enrichment talks that we're doing. Richard and I are sharing the talks. I'll be at 1 o'clock, Richard's mostly in the morning, and we'll be doing the talks on the sea day. So have a look at that, have a look for it in your little pamphlet or on your phone, and it'll give you the little bits that we're going to be talking about. So today we're down in Los Angeles, having left San Francisco. For those of you who are new to the talk, and those of you who would like a little bit more about my background, I grew up in a small coal mining town in England. My grandpa was an electrical engineer in the mines. He installed pumps to keep the mines dry, and in the 1920s, when he was installing the pumps, the town was running out of water, and so they connected the dewatering pumps up to the town water supply over 100 years ago. It's not the same pumps, but the old mine, even though it's closed now, is still supplying water for the town itself. So it's quite an interesting link, how you can get mining connected to the town. And my uncle was in the mining business, my brother was in my friends were in the mining business, and I joined the mining business. Didn't want to be underground, so I joined as an ecologist. And you may say, well, that's a little bit strange, but I do most of the environment, health and safety, community-related work. So that's a little bit about me. A little bit more about Los Angeles itself. On the left-hand side here, you can see the traditional Gabrielino Tongva villages and the territory, which overlaps nicely. You can see this bump here relates to Huntington Beach right there. So it goes all the way through and back into that area of Los Angeles. So when we're in Los Angeles, we will be actually in a place called Tavanga. And Tavanga was the name that the Tonga people gave to the world. And it comes from, it actually means the world in Tonga. It's a traditional territory. There are two different groups of Tonga people, the mainland Tonga, the terrestrial Tonga, and the island Tonga, which includes the islands of Catalina and its all surrounding islands. So it's also the nation itself. The Gabrielino Tongva Nation is recognized by the state of California and the California General Assembly. So much so that the center of the crest for the county of Los Angeles includes a Tonga woman. So you can see her traditional outfit. She's standing on the shores of the Pacific, and the mountains are in the background. What she's got in her hand is a traditional basket, and this was the basket that the land base, the interior Tonga, used to do to collect berries, acorns, and that sort of thing. So it's to show the richness of the land and the location of the Tonga actually on the crest. Coastal dwellers, the Tonga themselves, just a little note, this piece here is the mission of San Gabriel, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the Tonga people lived on the coast, and this is a modern representation of the type of craft that they would use to get out onto the sea. They've lived on the coast, probably the archaeological sites that have been excavated date back about 8,000 to 10,000 years. So they came down the coast, as we talked about the Olone yesterday, not 2 days ago, sorry, for San Francisco. They came down the coast around the same time. They traditionally fished far out from sea, and these canoes were made from redwood. We'll have a look at those a little bit later. But their economy was based, for the most part, the communities that were up against the sea. It was based on shellfish, marine mammals, and fish. And we can tell that from the excavation of the middens. So they're in the traditional villages, they just had garbage dumps, the same as we do today. And these middens were examples of exactly how they lived their life. And they discarded shells, they discarded fish bones and all that kind of stuff. And we can do the excavation of those, and that will tell us what the people used to eat. The interior Tongva, they had a more stable lifestyle. They had semi-permanent villages, or relatively permanent villages. They built huts and houses with thatched roofs and walls. You can see here there's a fence, if you look in this particular case. And this particular lady looks like she was harvesting berries or acorns. It was very important at that particular time that they were able to get food off the land. And as I mentioned in my talk just before San Francisco, acorns are very high in fat. Once you've bleached out the tannins, they're actually quite tasty, and you can get a lot of fat from them. We're not looking for fat these days because we're well nourished. They were looking for fat in those days because it was always a scarcity of food, and acorns themselves, and you'll see on the next slide, formed a source of food that could be stored if it was careful. So you could take the acorns through the winter, and you could store the acorns as you went forward. The interior settlements were usually adjacent to rivers or near artisanal wells. So you get upwelling water in certain areas, and then a village would form there. Very much like the types of villages and locations that we would look for. Good supply of food and a good supply of water. And this is the mythical, beautiful Tongva painting that was done by an artist who had rose-tinted glasses. But you can see a few important things here. You've got the use of baskets to carry goods, and they have dogs. Same as the Ohlone people, they have dogs. They lived in huts similar to the Ohlone people, made of branches with rushes and reeds across. Here's the boats, and you can see the villages going out that way. This is quite an interesting little artifact that's in there. It's actually a storage place. It's up off the ground to keep the rats and the mice away. So a little bit like you would have a modern granary these days that would sit on posts. It was exactly the same in this day. And you can see the huts and the people hunting traditionally there. In this particular case, it looks like it was adjacent to a marsh. And so I think what we're having here is a blend of food from the forest and food from the water. So get you that stable food supply year round, but during the harvest season in the fall, you would harvest and store the acorns and other high nutrient foods. The Tonga themselves are using an Aztec type language, so it was linked to the Central American language group, and one of their words, there's a thing called a kiz. These are kiz. It's K-I-Z-Z-H, and this is also the name of the people. They were called kiz at one time, but now it's Gabrielino Tongva people. Looking a little bit at moving on from the people and moving on to the shorelines, and Richard spoke a little bit about it this morning about changing sea levels. One of the things that we need to understand is that over the past 10,000 years, sea levels have come up quite a bit. 14,000 years ago, when we think these people came through, the sea levels would be down around where these blue contours are. So you can see, and most of the time you would build your village right next to the sea, because you obviously want to not have to carry things too far. You're dependent on the ocean for your food. You can then get into the hinterland to get berries, etc. But as the sea levels rose, it buried the villages, right? So we don't have good archaeological records going back, except for in the interior. And some of the interior archaeological records date back to some 8,000 years. So we think that the colonization of the coast was about 14,000 years ago, and recent data from San Clemente Island, just off the shore there, right here, show that there was a maritime culture. They were there, living, working, fishing, about 8,000 years ago. So we've got something in the record in that time. So the Tongva people have been there for a long time, and we're learning more and more about them as we are able to excavate more of the sites. Richard mentioned this morning a little bit about global currents and ocean currents, etc. When we think of sailing ships today, and when we think of even big vessels like this, we really don't take that much into consideration the ocean currents. What we have to realize is that in the old days, sailing ships were not able to go up into the wind. They couldn't tack like we can today. And where we see the coast here, right, we see the fact that the only way really to get to that coast from a sailing ship is from the west. So we had to come from the west across to the east. This was not crossable in the 1500s. So the ships all came across, and they came from Asia. So they were exploring around this way, up through Asia, and then they came across into this part of the coast of the US and California. And it was about in the 16th century that the Europeans were arriving, and this is the westbound and eastbound passages that the people were able to do. So they would leave the coast in the Philippines, Manila, etc. Excuse me, and they would sail across, and they would bump into the coast somewhere around here as they worked down their way down to Acapulco, which is where we're going to be in a few days' time. They were initially not looking for a home. It was just what they could get from this particular coast. They were looking for timber to repair masts. They were looking for timber to repair boats. And this particular part of the coast was very rich. It also had lots of fresh water, and it also had lots of animals that they could hunt and restock their food supplies with. So the shift in the economy was from extractive, or from subsistence to extractive as we went forward. And I'd like to just point out one kind of phenomenal piece. Here on your left is a drawing from the 1600s. Let's take that, and on the right is the actual satellite image as we are today. Let's take that in. 1600s, no cell phones, just a compass, a wooden boat, and a sextant. And you can survey an island like this, and this is the actual island. I think this is absolutely phenomenal, and I always think about it when we think about how far we can come in a day and how far we can drive in a day. You were walking, or you were on a horse, or you were at the mercy of the winds. So to get this kind of accuracy in the 1600s is wow. Oh my gosh. So, West Coast, European contact. I just added in this side Baja California and Baja California Sur, because that's where we're kind of headed down to Los Cabos at the tip before we go. First real contact with the Europeans was in 1542. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo came over to Catalina area and met the natives in that particular area. And at the time, he called it the Bay of Smoke. And it's an interesting thing, the Bay of Smoke, and I was talking a little bit about the history and how you needed to store your food. The natives at the time, the Tongva people, would actually smoke their fish, same as we do, for smoked salmon or whatever. They would smoke their fish, And that was why it was very smoky when he was there, because he had arrived during the time at which there was a fish catch, and he called it the Bay of Smokes. So quite an interesting piece. But nothing really happened from the 1500s for 200 years. It was just that the odd ship came across, and there was no real contact until somewhere in the 1700s, when the mission started to be established. And these numbers here indicate the first mission on the west coast in this particular part of California. And the one we're interested in today is San Gabriel Archangel. And San Gabriel Archangel was the fourth mission that was established. So this is an artist's rendering of the mission. This, as you can see, is a traditional Tongva hut, similar to the ones that we saw up in San Francisco. Now, in this particular case, it was a land expedition and not a marine expedition by Caspar de Portola in 1769, which was 1700s, that resulted in the foundation of this mission. And we'll have a look at this as it looks today. The mission system was a bit punitive to the Tongva people. They were forced to relocate close to the mission. Excuse me. Because the missionaries needed their labor. So it was semi-enslavement that they were forced to relocate next to the mission. The other thing that was a bit difficult for the Tongva people was that they didn't have any immunity to old world diseases. So the old world diseases, which were brought over by the Europeans, resulted in devastation to the populations and almost a total destruction and disintegration of the Tongva society itself. And this is how the mission looks today. You'll be able to see it if you go inland. You can see the windows here. This is the bell tower, and the windows that you could see on the previous drawing. 1781, 44 settlers from New Spain, which is now Mexico, established a settlement in downtown Los Angeles. That's only 250 years ago that we established the settlement. It was post 1776 for the formation of the U.S. It was very interesting. So, if we have a look at the current Tongva people, in the 2008 census, about 1,700 people identified today as Tongva people, and the Tongva nation is recognized fully by the state of California. So, having had a look at the development of the coast from the geology, people, how was it opened up? How did we get people here? How did we kind of see things coming? This is the traditional Tongva canoe that they had, that I showed you the picture of them rowing it. It's made of redwood planks sewn together. And the decoration here is shells. So these are abalone shells along the side of it. We don't know whether that was traditional or not, but we believe it was traditional because you found abalone shells where they found the wrecks of the old disintegrated canoes. So the movement of people, European exploration, came in these original ships with the mission for missionary and crusades and all that kind of stuff to get through the colonial period. From about 1542 to 1770, there was very little contact from the Europeans. Then it came through that they were looking for timber for making boats, they were looking for timber for repairing things, you have to think about this. you've got a tree and you're on the west coast of California, you need to bring all of your equipment across. So one of the entrepreneurs actually had a whole shipbuilding set shipped through the Caribbean onto the east coast of the US, and they moved that whole, by land, by mule, across to the west coast so that they could then go ahead and start to build ships. Because you would have to find iron, you'd have to find steel, you'd have to have foundries and all that kind of stuff. But imagine the forethought for somebody who says, hey, I'm going to need ships. I'm going to ship a whole workshop across with me. I think it's phenomenal in the Formula One when they move tools and that around the world today, but that was real forethought as to how they could do it. And then obviously the big Spanish galleon showed up. This is actually a replica that's sailing today. This is one of the replica Spanish galleons, and you can see here why they can just go mostly in the direction of the wind. When we were sailing out of San Francisco yesterday on the port side of the ship, there was a whole bunch of sailboats with their spinnakers up. I don't know if you saw that, right? And they were going downwind, right? They got the spinnakers up, they got the sail up. That's basically all that was. It was a big set of spinnakers that were up on there. They could hold them up or down, but they really couldn't adjust the angle. They could do a little bit, but not too much. So the Spanish came, they came down in the colonization period through to about the mid-1800s. And then there was the Mexican period that followed that before the cessation of the West Coast from Mexico back to the US, as we spoke about in about 1848, that was. So the earliest industries on the coast were mostly shipbuilding, that sort of thing, but then the Europeans ended up looking for how they could exploit the coast. And the first real exploitation of the coast was these fun guys. We're back to sea otters again, my favorite animal. You'll see them in all of my talks, even if they're not relevant. There'll be one pop in there somewhere. Sea otters for fur. I mean, the sea otter pelt itself, and I mentioned this before, but just for those of you who weren't here, it's got about between 600,000 and 1 million hairs per square inch, which makes it very soft. It also allows the sea otter to survive in the cool water temperatures. And a few interesting facts about sea otters. Throw a few things up there. Densest fur of all animals, great, okay, good. They don't have any fat. And they eat a lot of stuff. I'll let you read this. And there is one mistake in this particular display here that I got from one of the pieces. This otter here is actually a river otter. It's not a sea otter. So I don't know why and how he or she slipped in. Everybody else is that. And you can tell river otters and sea otters. When I lived on Vancouver Island, where Victoria is, we used to see otters in the ocean all the time. But they were river otters. They had the long, pointy tail, and they were about this big. And they were always raiding the area. When you bring your salmon catch in to clean it, there's a bucket and a tray, and it's got a little door, and all the guts and everything go into the center. So I was there cleaning my fish with my boys, and this massive sea otter comes ambling up. And we're cleaning our fish here. He opens the door, pops inside, picks up all of the guts that he could carry, and headed off back to the ocean. He didn't close the door behind him, but he did a good job. Anyway, these guys were hunted nearly to extinction. You can see here, this is an old photograph from the 1600s. The demand for pelts was very, very high in Europe. They were traded around the world. They also hunted in that particular time that the fur traders were hunting for things like fur seals, which they went to almost extinction, river otters, beaver, and when you got inside, they were looking for fox, mink, etc. And there was even the odd harbor seal that got taken for their skins. It was a very exploitative piece. In the San Francisco Bay Area, the sea otters were actually wiped out to extinction, and it was unregulated. The whole population of sea otters that comes along the west coast now came from a small population of 50 animals that was found in a place called Bixby Creek. It doesn't matter, along California's Big Sur coast. For some reason, they missed those 50 animals, and they gradually populated out as they were being protected. And as I mentioned before, they're very important for keeping the kelp in good health, because they eat sea urchins and they need a tremendous amount of food. The sea otter population is expanding nicely to the north, and it's about at the limit of its range and coming to the south. They have range limits for all species, and it's going well to the north, but it's not expanding much to the south right now. The other thing that the exploitation was done was on whales. Off the coast, the migratory gray whales come down, and this gives you an idea of the size of them. And looking at how you identify gray whales, we've got faces, they've got flukes. On the flukes, they've got a kind of an individual footprint. And if you look at the flukes themselves, you can see little marks. So you can see here that there's a mark on that fluke, and the people would then be able to take a photograph, and they would then be able to identify that whale when it pops up in different locations. If it comes down to Los Cabos and then goes back up to northern British Columbia or into Alaska for the summer. Unfortunately, we're missing the whale season. The whales get down to Los Cabos end of November, early December. And I can sit at my home in Los Cabos and I can watch them actually blowing out in front of my house. It's really fabulous. If we look at the whaling stations, there was one real whaling station, and this is just a marker. There's nothing left at the station itself. It was at a place called Portuguese Bend. It was established in 1869, and it lasted about 45 years. It lasted about 45 years because the exploitation of the whales was such that they just decimated everything, and they took all the whales that were available. And this is just the guys cutting up the whale. Two different things happened with whales and why they went extinct. Last real hunt was in 1885. So if you think that they established in 1869, 15 years later, they'd taken all the whales and there was nothing left. There was also a decline in the need for whale oil. Whale oil used to be used for lamps for lighting. But cheaper alternatives like kerosene made it uneconomic, and they also fished out all the whales. The whales themselves are now protected. I think they were given commercial protection in about 1949, and the population has returned phenomenally, so that when you do go on whale watching tours in Los Cabos, you actually do see quite a lot of whales. It's really fabulous, and you can identify the different groups. You can see here, this whale has a slightly different notch on her tail. And again, the other one had the notch right about here. This one's got a notch right there. Shows you a little bit about how you can tell the different whales apart. So, we went through the whaling, and one of the things that I want to quickly talk about here is the tragedy of the commons. Now, the tragedy of the commons is a kind of an exploitation piece for natural resources. It's called the tragedy of the commons because when there were common areas in England, you were allowed to put your sheep or your cattle out to graze. So it was great when the population was small, because you had a few sheep and a few cattle and it was a sustainable event. However, when the whole audience puts their sheep and cattle out to graze, pretty soon the grazing deteriorates and you don't get any grazing for anybody. So the tragedy of the commons in this particular case was that sea otters and whales were hunted to extinction, nearly extinction. And then it becomes unprofitable because you can't catch any sea otters for pelts to run your operation. The whole thing crashes and it has to come back up again. But it's taken 100 years for the sea otters to come back. So that's why we have catch limits, that's why we have hunting limits, etc., because of the tragedy of the commons. And I will be talking about that a little bit more as we move along. So, changing population. Wow, I always love these graphs. 1890, there was nobody living in Los Angeles. Well, not quite. But then we get through and we see this massive bump again. We looked at California the other day and we look at this bump. And the orange is the change from the previous year. So in the 50s and 60s, you got these massive increases, and it's starting to stabilize now a little bit. Population increase is still going. This is 2020, this is decades. So you can see here, curve goes up, and it's starting to plateau somewhere between 13 and 14 million people in greater Los Angeles. I think we're at about the limit of what we can do. Now, the development of Los Angeles went from subsistence with the Tonga people, and then it went through exploitation with the sea otters and the whales and the timber and all that kind of stuff. But in the early 1900s, and you can see here 1913, the Southern Pacific Railroad completed its first major port. First major port meant that we were shifting from exploitation to some kind of commerce, some kind of sustainable commerce. And what we were trying to do here is we were trying to then use this as a shipping port. And actually Los Angeles surpassed San Francisco as the West Coast's busiest seaport in the early 1930s with a great big expansion. What we think of now of shipping is not like stuff loose, it's all in containers. Right? We think of sea cans, big, either 40-foot, 48-foot, or 20-foot units. The first shipping of seaport from Los Angeles was in 1959. Somebody delivered 20 containers to the port. The port now, this is what the port looks like. Well, this is what the port what you had the port before. This is 2004. You can see the Port of Los Angeles, managed by the Los Angeles Harbor Department, now occupies 7,500 acres. Okay? 7,500 acres. And it's adjacent to the Port of Long Beach. And this is what the port looks like now. This is where we'll be docking. Tomorrow, we'll be right in here. And one of the interesting things is we come in through this seawall that was built in the 50s, okay? And you come in through here, and we'll go up and we'll dock in here. As we come in, there's a phenomenal little piece of land right here that I want to show you about. You might just be able to see it, but there's a little rehabilitation plot that I'll show you later that was for seagrass. They've done a little bit of work to get seagrass to come back in here. It's very, very difficult to see. And this is the bit that I'm looking at here. Wow. Somebody says, well, that looks like one of those paintings that's out in the lobby, right? Well, it's not. Each one of those is a 40-foot sea container. Each one of those is a 40-foot sea container. And you can see it's got kind of like tram lines, railroad lines between. That's because everything that's put in this particular stock is done automatically, controlled by computers, And they use these little tram lines so that they can drive over the top of stacks of sea containers, and the wheels are down on the ground, and they use a machine that looks like this. It's fully automated. You can see no driver, no nothing. They pick this up, hoist it all the way up to the top, and then they can drive over 5 sea cans high, and they put this all in. It is phenomenal. Anyway, I must move on. I don't want to take too much more of your time. So, another reason that California was very important, obviously, is the production of oil. For those of you who know Huntington Beach, welcome to Huntington Beach in the 20s. Here's the beach, and here was where the oil was developed. If you look at Huntington Beach in the 1960s, that's what it looks like. It's fabulous, right? We've got a beach. Nobody ever takes photographs in Huntington Beach. This is the Huntington Beach Pier. Nobody ever takes photographs looking this way. They all take photographs looking to the south from Huntington Beach. I had to work really hard to find these 2 photographs, I'll tell you. Anyway, it was very important. These derricks were producing vast amounts of oil for the population. And you can see here where it's out under the ocean, and this is the interior piece. And if you ask Richard, he's sitting up on the back here, he'll give you the whole background as to why the geology works like that. But this is what we were looking at for Huntington Beach. But interestingly, there's still oil production in downtown Los Angeles. What? There's a building in downtown Los Angeles. Inside this are the derricks and the pump jacks. Wow. In the city. Wow. The Tower of Hope. Can you see the shape?
It is.
Inside that, there's a producing oil well. It's amazing what you can hide in the middle of a city. So if you look around and you're downtown Los Angeles, you can find the Tower of Hope. And you can say, well, I know what's in there. It's an actual pump jack. Now, looking at Huntington Beach today, this was where all those wellheads were. And it's now a conservation area, right there, up against the beach. It's a wetland for wildlife in migration. It's really phenomenal. But this piece is still producing oil. And you've seen the nodding donkeys that you see in Texas and that sort of thing. If you go and you look at this, this is where the nodding donkeys are. They're gradually phasing it out, but it's there. And that's Huntington Beach today. I did find a more modern picture, but look at the shape of that building. I wonder what it hides. Any guesses? So with development comes risk. With shipping comes risk. 1969, there was a blowout of Platform A, dropped quite a lot of oil into the ocean, and it raised environmental awareness as we go forward. It was actually one of the things that caused the first Earth Day. 1969 was the Santa Barbara oil spill. 1970 was the first year that we had Earth Day, and that's been continuing as we go forward. That changed quite a lot, the perception within California, within the Los Angeles area, of what we expect from conservation, what we expect from companies, what we expect from people as they develop things. It also precipitated a very large conservation effort along the coast. So we have a kind of a pendulum. We go one way, then we go back the other way, and we end up in the middle somewhere. This is cleanup of a river. There are a phenomenal number of conservation projects going on across the Los Angeles area. This is where we are in Los Angeles. You look up the coast and in the interior. Most of these are focused on water. They're focused on rivers. They're focused on developing habitat as we go along. And remember, I told you this is a schematic of the port. That little piece that we couldn't really see is actually an eelgrass mitigation project. Port of Los Angeles wanted to extend a pier. They were given approval, provided they did the mitigation project for the eelgrass. And there's other marshland areas as we go away from here. So we went from full exploitation, stuff out in the open, oil drilling, everything, to something now that we've got little hidden oil wells in places, which is kind of cool, really, when you think about it, right? That's what they do with electricity substations in cities as well. They put them in really nice buildings, so you don't know what they are. You see all kinds of wires coming out of this building? Have a look. It's probably a substation. So, if we look at what's going on in the future, this is looking at sea level rise, and we're looking at sea level rise of, something where the risks are related to the city. Los Angeles is actually pretty well placed. Not like Florida, but these areas are the areas that are under threat from sea level rise as we go forward. So Los Angeles will fare reasonably well. Other areas like Huntington Beach might not do as well. So you've got areas that are going to flood down in here. But we've got to think about this as we develop cities and as we develop cities adjacent to the ocean. When the Native Americans came down and they built their cities in the 14,000 years ago, they built their little villages next to the ocean. They had to continually react to the post-Pleistocene changes in sea level, because we've gone from about 125 feet below where we are today to the current sea level. We're doing that right now. We have to think about that as we go. But there's hope. See, there's another photograph looking south in Huntington Beach. There's no photographs looking this way. It's always that way, but you can see a little oil terminal up there. So if we think about what Huntington Beach looked like in the 1960s from the photograph, you think about where we've come today. That area is now a conservation area. This area looks absolutely beautiful, and I've been there and I can attest to that. So there's hope. We can get things right. We can do things right. The sea otters are coming back. There's plenty of gray whales for us to see in Los Cabos. Not this trip, unfortunately, but the next trip. So we've come a long way today, from 10,000 years ago when the Tongva people were in sustainable equilibrium with their environment, through the exploitation phase to something that hopefully is a little bit more sustainable. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for spending your early afternoon with me, and I'm open to any questions.